Great. Well, hello everybody. Great to see so many people joined in. And welcome to this latest episode in the Navigating the Design to Manufacture Journey series. So my name's Matt Wasley. I'm part of the Enabling Technologies team at KTN. My particular bit is photonics, but I'll work kind of broadly across lots of technologies. And I'm joined, my colleagues, Abby Hurd and Kevin Hallis from our manufacturing team. You'll see them on the call as well. At KTN, we're all really about connections and connecting people for positive change. And as part of that, we work with lots and lots of businesses that are taking this sort of journey from going from having the idea and developing the product to taking it into manufacture and then into the marketplace. And we see lots of problems and solutions and opportunities and all the sort of different trajectories that you go on this journey. And that's really what this series is about. So what we're trying to do, if you tuned into any of these before, you'll know is we're trying to sort of give you some really sort of useful insights into different aspects of that journey. And also build a sort of UK-wide community for people that are doing this for sort of partnerships and collaborations and customers and suppliers and such like. And so you'll have seen during registration, you had an opportunity to register for Meeting Mojo, our networking platform. And there'll be a link coming out for this if you hadn't had a chance. So I really would encourage you to do that. If this was a physical event, which we're all kind of missing at the moment, we'd be able to chat at coffee, and you could single out people or talk to the speakers. And we're trying to sort of recreate this as best we can. So today we're looking at risk regulation and standards. And when I was thinking about how I was going to say this introduction, the thing that kept coming into my head was a space mission from back in 1998. It was the Mars Climate Explorer. So this is a $200 million space probe, and like many of these complex systems, it had different interconnecting parts. And one system was built by Lockheed Martin, and it needed to talk to another system which was built by NASA, and it's reporting thrust back. And the Lockheed Martin system reported the impulse thrust back in it's pound/seconds imperial measurement. Unfortunately, the NASA system was expecting that force impulse to be read back in Newton seconds. And as a consequence, well, nobody knows what happened to the probe. It either crashed on Mars or it escaped into deep space. But the point being that the mission had a catastrophic failure due to standards. But on a more positive note of how where standards are so important and can impact in a positive way, and I'll keep the space theme, as it's kind of an interest of mine. You think about the airlocks on spaceships. So back at the end of the Apollo program, the Americans and the Soviets thought it'd be a pretty good idea if the spacecraft could actually dock with one another, just in case of emergency and international cooperation. And so you want to make sure you're going to get that airlock right. So they developed a sort of standard for the interoperable airlock. And now, just recently in the news, because of the way that you can specify and you get the standards right, has enabled commercial space opportunities. So now commercial companies like SpaceX are able to actually dock with the ISS and get paid for it. So I mean that's a multi-million-dollar space example, but actually we see this in sectors across the piece. So whether your business is in manufacturing or health or agri-food or transport, the use of kind of regulation and standards, it can actually open up opportunities, open up innovation. It can put you in a place where perhaps your competitors aren't. So that's useful as well. And we'll also be looking, of course, at risk. And how you manage that risk is obviously really important for your business. But if I think of another, keep going back, my last example I promised from the space industry, if you think you're sat on that SpaceX ship with 2 million, like several tons of rocket propellant underneath you, there's some risks involved in that, and yet that's a journey that happens continuously and can be made safe by an understanding of standards, regulation, and risk, and all rolled into one. And so it's the case, for business more widely. So I think it's a really interesting topic we've got for you today, and we've got three great speakers that will give you different insights into it. So that's all for me for just now. I'll join you a bit later. So I'll hand you over now to Ali McElmoy from Technology Scotland, who's going to introduce our speakers and take it from there. Ali.
Yeah, cheers, Matt. Thanks for that, and great to be co-hosting with you today. Matt and I do a lot of work through our Photonics Scotland network, so it's nice to be collaborating on a slightly different topic today. My name is Ali McElmoy. I'm the Chief Exec at Technology Scotland. We are the Industry Association for Scotland's enabling technology sector. And among other things, we are the home for Product Design Scotland, who are your co-hosts for today. I'll be your chair for this section of the meeting, and I'll facilitate the Q&A with our three panellists, who today are Stuart, Alistair and Rory. We have a distinctly Scottish feel to the panel today. That was not necessarily by design. I don't think it reflects a greater thirst for risk and regulation north of the border. Maybe it does, I don't know. I've got no evidence to back that either way. But just to preempt any questions, clearly anything that is discussed today has broader context for the whole of the UK. There's nothing Scottish specific here. As far as I'm aware, as of the timing of this meeting, risk and regulation are not currently devolved to the Scottish Parliament. So I think we're in pretty safe ground to talk more generally to our audience right across the UK. So we'll get started in just a wee second. A few bits of housekeeping just before we do. You can submit questions to our panel at any time, and we obviously encourage you to do so using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Questions that are submitted into the chat box tend to get lost in the kind of deluge of information that is contained within there. So please use the Q&A box. Another thing that helps us a lot is if somewhere within your question, if you could identify which of the panelists your question is aimed at, that helps us a lot when it comes round to the Q&A. We'll run the Q&A as a single thing at the end of the three speakers. And if there really isn't a particular panelist that you want your question directed at, then I'll just pick on somebody at the end. But it does help if there is somebody more specific. Okie doke, so I think that's enough preamble. So we'll go straight on now to the speakers. And first up is Stuart Kelly at Systolic, who's going to talk to us about risk. So Stuart, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ali. I think that should be my slide sharing now. So I'm Stuart Kelly. I work as a product development consultant. Currently I work mostly with early stage companies, work with them as a virtual member of their development team, typically often at the stage before they're ready to bring in a full in-house development team, or providing some additional consultancy support. To pick up on Ali's point, I work with companies in Scotland, but also throughout the UK and in Western Europe, so it's by no means a Scotland-only business. And one of the things that I've learned in my career, but also in some of the ways that I like to spend my spare time, is that all new adventures go better if you spend some time on risk management in advance. That certainly doesn't mean that I haven't had any cold nights sleeping in a wet sleeping bag, or any things unexpected happening on projects, but I think it does mean that most of the time I'm a bit better prepared for it than I would have been otherwise. So in these few minutes that I've got, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of risk management in the context of product development projects, and then Alistair and Rory will be talking a bit more detail on some of the things that I talk about. I think there's always a lot of excitement about developing a new product, and sometimes it can seem a bit negative to spend your time focusing on the risks. But I would say there's a lot of benefits to thinking about it. Maybe we should be talking about risk-benefit management rather than just risk management. One particular area that I think it helps with a lot is defining the right product requirements. If you ever found that your project starts to run into a bit of slowing down when you're trying to define the detailed requirements. Maybe you're discussing whether it needs a certain alarm or whether it needs an additional sensor to detect a potential failure mode. Going through a risk assessment process can be a very helpful way of both making that decision and then also having a documented evidence as to why you made that decision. And one thing that I think is definitely true is the more original your product, the more that you're trying to disrupt markets, the less like anything else that's there, the tougher it's going to be to predict what the biggest hazards are or the biggest issues that you're going to have to address along the way. Quick bit on definitions. So when I talk about hazards, I mean something that's a potential source of harm. So for a chap on the mountain bike in the left here, there's obviously quite a lot of hazards around him, but is he taking a big risk? He's probably quite good at what he's doing, and he's probably done it quite a few times before, so maybe the risk isn't actually that high. On the other hand, the risk and the level of risk is about the severity of the harm that could come about and also the probability of the harm occurring. There's a lot of nuances under that I don't have time to go into, but I think just to distinguish between hazards and risks is quite important. The next thing I think is very important and sometimes a source of problem in risk management is it's important to define what type of risks you're dealing with. In the context of risk of product development, there's quite a lot of different levels. So you might be thinking about business risks, you might be thinking about things that could derail your project management, you might be thinking about technical risks that could cause your design to not work the way that you want it to. You might be focused on user risks, and that's where a lot of the standards focus is on what are the risks to your patients if you treat them with a certain device. And then something which is rightly getting more attention now, and there are more standards and regulations being considered, is the risk of bringing a new product, the risk that poses to society, wider society, and to the environment. So as I say, it's important to define the scope of your risk management activities. I would say it'd be virtually impossible to do all 5 of these in a single analysis. You might be able to do a couple. You might be able to look at business risks and project management risks in one go. You might be able to look at user risks and environmental risks in one go. But if you try to do too many, you'll find that it's very difficult to manage. For each of these types of risks, there's obviously a lot of experience that's going to help you to identify hazards. I definitely encourage making use of all the experience that you've got in your team. That'll get you maybe 80% of the way there, and then beyond that, it's important to learn from people who've done other similar things. And really, if you think about it, all regulations and standards are essentially based on problems that people have experienced in the past. So whatever your particular product is, there will certainly be standards, regulations, guidelines that are applicable, even if it's a similar product in a different industry. There are lots of resources out there to help you think about what hazards you might have to deal with. The next thing that's important is to define the criteria you're going to use for estimating risks in advance of doing it. That makes all discussions between different disciplines much more straightforward if you can get that agreed in advance. I'm not going to go into the details of what I've got on the slide there, but what I'll do is put together a little example to illustrate how you might go about estimating risks. So the task I set myself was to assess the business risk of giving this presentation to 100 people, most of whom I've never met. So what are the hazards there? Top 3 that came into my mind were boredom, poor communication, and plagiarism. So what I would then do is I would go through and define what are the hazardous situations associated with that, and for each of them, what might the harm be, what would I consider to be the severity of that harm, the probability of that harm, and then depending on the combinations there, I would assess the risk probably as either acceptable, so I don't need to do anything else about it. It's only a 10-minute talk, so the chances of people falling asleep, I decided, was relatively low. Slow broadband connection, quite likely. I was actually quite worried that that would happen since I'd written it down, but as far as I know, it hasn't, unless I'm just talking to myself just now. Plagiarism, you might recognize some diagrams that I've copied, which to me would be pretty catastrophic as a habitual rule follower. So I really need to do something about that. Next thing to do then is to control the risks that I don't think would be acceptable. So I've made sure that the kids can't get into Netflix at the moment. If I did have any diagrams, then I would definitely make sure to change the fonts and colors to reduce the chances of being spotted there. I don't actually. But one thing there actually is that the next thing to do, or the next thing you need to think about, is do the ways that you're the way that you're controlling risks actually introduce any new issues, and that could be the case with the last one there. So you've seen all the words that are there before, I think. I've put up a few examples there of risk management standards that are worth looking at if you want to get into more detail on this. Obviously also very welcome to get in touch with me, and my contact details are at the end there. So hopefully that sets the scene for Alistair to take over now.
Great, thank you very much. Okie doke. So, not sure if you can see my screen yet.
Not yet, Alistair.
Okay.
Just while you're sorting that out, I'll just so if you can go ahead and try and get your screen up, Alistair, well, that would be good.
Okay.
Just while Alistair's putting his screen up there, just to be a reminder for people, please do input your questions into the Q&A. We'll gather those together for the panel session at the end. That looks good.
Okay, doc.
That looks good there, and on you go. Perfect.
Right, thank you very much. Okay, thanks very much, Stuart. That was a great presentation. And we'll kind of continue the theme of risk management in 14971 at the start of this presentation. But really the topic for today, it's all about the culture of an organisation to produce safe products or products of a suitable quality. And as we progress on here, excuse me, I'll just get to the button. A little overview of who we are. So Lorick Consultancy is a functional safety consultancy that operates in two industries predominantly, automotive and medical. We offer three types of support. We have a set of training courses in both industries, consultancy predominantly for newer companies in a sector, and then also support when we muck in and effectively become part of the team. And moving on to get started, Stuart talked there about 14971, the risk management standard in the medical device sector. And in this standard, like many others, about what top management should be doing. So, you know, to satisfy this requirement for risk management, they should have adequate resources. They should ensure the resources are adequately trained, competent individuals. There should be some kind of acceptance criteria defined. Obviously, you're going to do this based on international and national standards or regulations. And then, like many things nowadays, in theory, you should be taking into account state of the art. So the hail and pace relationship there is this really about top management? And the answer is no, it's not about top management. It's about the organisation. The whole organisation needs to buy into this. You need to have an intuitive process, second nature, and that way you'll bring everybody on board. Yes, top management should be delegating things, but if they're not bought in, you then get into the buck passing scenario. Or the other side of the coin is then you end up with the anchor, whereby people get completely bogged down by dotting I's and crossing T's, that checklist mentality. As mentioned, we do a lot of work in the automotive industry, functional safety. The standard there, ISO 26262, has a very good section about safety culture. And it talks about good as opposed to poor safety culture. So accountability is not traceable, obviously not good. Cost and schedule all take precedence over safety and quality. That's certainly not what you're trying to do. The required resources are not planned or allocated in a timely manner. Again, you don't want to have that happening. And then the last point, and we'll dwell on this in a little bit more detail, a passive attitude towards safety, dependence on testing at the end of the product development cycle, or management only reacts when there's a problem in the field. Obviously, that's not what you're wanting. You want a proactive attitude. So we'll come back to those two in a little bit more detail. Also in that standard, there's a section about safety thinking. And this includes allowing a questioning attitude, prevents complacency, it commits to excellence, and fosters the taking of responsibility. Now, and as an example, and coming back to the first point on questioning attitude, we don't have enough time to go through this whole scenario. It's quite a long story. But in 1977, the Tenerife air disaster, it's a fog-bound airport. It has no ground radar. And because the taxiway is blocked up, two 747s have to taxi down the main runway. The KLM had gone the full length of the runway and was in the start position. The Pan Am was to taxi down the runway and leave at exit 3. Because of the poor visibility, they missed exit 3 and carried on. There was then a radio exchange between the control tower and the Pan Am flight, but that wasn't heard by the KLM because of interference on the radio. They lost 3 seconds of the transmission. They didn't request a repeat or challenge what they'd missed. The captain of the KLM flight then pushed the throttles forward and the KLM started heading down the runway. There was a subsequent exchange between the control tower and the Pan Am, confirming the Pan Am was still on the runway and that the Pan Am would report when it was off the runway. This was heard by the KLM flight engineer, who immediately questioned the cockpit and said, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" To which the captain of the KLM said, "Oh yes," and continued accelerating down the runway. Now this tragedy resulted in 583 people losing their lives, but like many tragedies, it brought a wholesale cultural change in the aviation industry. Following that, use of standard language, use of standard code words, the repeating and confirming messages, but probably more relevant to our point there, it brought in crew resource management training, which was about, amongst other things, how junior members of staff could challenge a superior in a way that would not lead to a defensive response or in any way insulting them. So, like many of these things, it produced a huge improvement in the industry, but sadly on the back of a very tragic event. And without a shadow of doubt, and I know we're going to get onto this in a bit more detail with Rory, requirements are absolutely central to good, safe design. We've got a quote here from Professor Nancy Leveson, who's one of the best known people in systems and safety engineering. And basically what she's pointing out there, that in hundreds of accident reports, even though software is involved, the problem was traced back to requirements. Requirements have to take on certain characteristics. They have to be uniquely identified. They have to be unambiguous. They have to be consistent. They have to be traceable. They have to be verifiable. Requirements do not need to be pinned down at the start of a design phase. They do need to be pinned down before you go into the verification phase. And next subject, and hopefully I've not insulted our host here by retitling the webinar, but it's navigating the design to the end of expected service life journey, because the exercise doesn't stop when you release the product. Medical device sector is very good in this area. Post-market surveillance is a huge part of that industry. Gathering data, analysing data. But coming back to our proactive attitude, analysing data for trends to identify when things are going to go wrong, rather than fixing something after it has gone wrong. Also applies to cybersecurity, and particularly nowadays, if you're talking about something like a server in a hospital, the reaction time to deal with these things has to be very short. And this is obviously very much about the culture within the organisation. And also tied into the subject of requirements, one of the greatest sort of clashes of cultures nowadays, particularly in safety-related industry, is using agile software development in safety-related industries. Perfectly acceptable, perfectly achievable, but there is, as I say, a good management activity that has to take place. Not a lot of information around on that nowadays. It's slightly disappointing. Both automotive and medical have minimal coverage in their standards. But in the medical device sector, there is an excellent guidance document, TIR 45, which is all about this balanced view. And it'll give you things like, we are agile, we don't need design documentation, and it will clearly point out that's not defendable in the medical device industry. On the other side of the coin, documentation is produced simply to satisfy some real or imagined requirement while providing no value to the development team. So it takes a very good stance on that one and gives a good balanced view. So to come to an end, and I think we're pretty well on time, cultural summary. Whole organisation needs to buy into the culture. Processes need to be intuitive and second nature to get people to buy in. The goal needs to satisfy safety, risk and quality objectives, obviously not forgetting the customer there either. Systematic approaches, good requirements management is essential. A proactive approach from the organisation, and you need to keep supporting even after manufacture. That needs to go to the end of the service life of the product. So just to say thank you, to mention that we do have a 10% discount on our training courses at the moment. So if you're interested, please feel to get in touch. And this is one of the last slides we actually use in our training courses. And a participant 2 weeks ago asked if these were our two offices. Unfortunately not, but I think it'd probably get a bit cold in the winter if they were. Okay, thanks very much.
Cheers, Alistair. Yeah, that would certainly be impressive, but it certainly makes for a nice closing slide. If nothing else. So, okay, so we're now going to go to our final speaker, who's Rory Ingram, who's the MS Design Engineering team lead, and MS are also a sponsor of Product Design Scotland. So, doubly happy to have Rory with us today. So, Rory, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ali. I'm just trying to find my notes, which have disappeared off screen, so bear with me. Teething problems that worked earlier.
problem. While Rory works that out, just to remind you all again that you can submit questions at any time through the Q&A. We've had a few coming in. Please keep doing so.
So can you see my presented presentation screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I've got my notes. Bear with me. I shall minimize this window. So hello, thanks for that. Thanks for your patience there. Apologies for that. Teething problems. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rory Ingram. I'm a design engineer by trade with 17 years in industry experience gained across defence, consumer, maritime and oil and gas sectors. For the last 4 of those years, I've worked in a research and technology organisation, supporting companies operating in many other sectors too. Anything from aquaculture to space, so quite a range. The RTO I work for is the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland, which is led by the University of Strathclyde. NMIS Group brings together research, industry and the public sector to transform skills, productivity and innovation to attract investment and establish Scotland as a global leader in advanced manufacturing. Like was said earlier though, we don't just work with Scottish companies, we work with companies from all over the world. Internationalism is one of the university's objectives as well. NMIS has been established in collaboration with the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland, Scottish Funding Council and Renfrewshire Council, so quite a consortium. This graphic shows you where my team's expertise is with respect to product development on the route to market acceptance. We perform these activities with clients on collaboration or collaboration partners who are seeking to develop new products. We're not a design consultancy as such, but sometimes it will make sense to come to us instead, most commonly to access different funding sources or to access specific design for manufacturer experience. But obviously every situation is different, so should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. As Ali says, we are network sponsors of Product Design Scotland, and we signpost inquiries their way when it's not a natural or comfortable fit for us. So we are collaborating with design consultancies. Areas we as a team work in cover product design and development, as shown on the left of the slide here. This includes requirement capture, conceptual and prototype development, material selection, method of manufacture selection, cost modelling, and so on. And this is bolstered by another theme shown on the right-hand side here, which is around market acceptance, which covers technology readiness level assessment, goals and objectives setting, validation planning, design verification, liaison with test houses and third parties for validation trials and independent witnessing. But we do have other themes too, but these are the most pertinent for today. This is not a sales pitch, this is just to give you an insight into what we're doing. The route to market acceptance phrase is something that I've coined in the last year or so, and it's not to be confused with route to market, which is more commercially focused. Market acceptance is when your product ticks all the boxes of the end user and they are willing to accept it and purchase it. This generally entails compliance to specifications, standards, regulations, or anything else in the contract, and I'll come back to this. There's a lot to consider when developing new products. If you're doing it from scratch or for the first time, you possibly won't know where to start, and there'll be lots of things you haven't considered or thought to consider. It's quite daunting, but you have to start somewhere, and the best place to start is with defining the requirements, as Alistair mentioned already. Pew's Total Design provides a good design framework and is one that we as a team tend to apply for product development as it logically presents the design function as a systematic and disciplined process. The design core introduced by Pew is shown on the left of this slide with a detailed view of the specification categories on the right-hand side. The requirements can be captured by category name under sections of your specification. For example, performance is one category and life and service might be another. So for the purposes of your specification, you must establish a specific requirement. So let's say you're looking at life and service and you select a 25-year service life. You go on to do this for all of the categories on the right-hand side here, and this yields a robust requirement specification. Now, of course, the old garbage in, garbage out analogy applies here. So to ensure a robust specification, you'll need to do market research and engage with the market or development partners in order to define sensible, achievable, and essential requirements. The requirement specification should be frozen, only to be revised periodically after project milestones or upon a conscious change in direction. For example, if you have a change in design pressure or design temperature, then of course that would merit a change in your specification. Oops, sorry, my notes have screwed up here. So everything revolves around requirements, hence the importance of carefully defining these up front. The specification you've created gives you a checklist which you can utilise throughout the conceptual product development, the detailed design, the design verification, the prototyping and the validation phases. Alistair mentioned you don't have to nail them down straight away, but you do before the design verification, and that's a good point. So you can mature the requirements, but once you start verifying and building and prototyping, then you're going to have problems if you haven't got your requirements specified at that point. So once you've satisfied all of the requirements for the specification and validated the performance, then you should have achieved a quality product or outcome. Assuming you've done your market research, your stakeholder engagement and subsequent requirement capture right in the first place, this should then maximise your chances for market acceptance. Now, there are many risks associated with product development. Some examples: missing something when capturing the requirements, especially if you've gone into the verification phase. A concept failing verification and requiring rework, a design being unmanufacturable, costs being too high based on anticipated volumes. These are all commonly encountered risks or challenges in product development projects. To manage risks throughout the product development process, it's pertinent to be diligent in your approach, and we would always recommend a stage-gated design review process, including input before or during these reviews from key stakeholders or subject matter experts. Holding these at predetermined stages, such as specification review, concept review, detailed design review. Now, you should freeze the design requirements after each review in order to ensure everyone is clear on the design intent and thus they're aware of any resultant impact with respect to cost or lead time from any changes made outside of this process. And it's advisable to perform failure mode effects and analysis as well at the conceptual phase, whereby you examine the function of each part and identify how it might fail. Then you seek to build in mitigations to eliminate or reduce these failures as your concept evolves. So as your concept evolves, you should update your FMEA or your FMICA results to ensure all components and functions are being considered. Now, at risk of sounding like Donald Rumsfeld from his 2002 speech, now's the time to talk about known and unknown knowns. This philosophy was coined by the ancient Greeks and has been referenced by NASA amongst others. Now, you can categorize risk into 4 types. The known ones are the easiest ones to deal with, as you have awareness of them and can proactively deal with them. Where things start to get dangerous and pose more threat are the unknown risks, the ones that you have no awareness of. These have to be handled reactively generally. Ideally, you want to convert as many risks as possible into known knowns. Many will start out as known unknowns, which you'll be maturing and developing in the course of the product development until they become de-risked known quantities or known knowns. An example of a known unknown might be a novel method of manufacture or material which you wish to explore. When you satisfy that it is usable and capable of meeting requirements, it is upgraded to a known known. Unknown knowns are risks that have been identified during the project planning stage, but were not and go on to affect the project. These usually result from poor communication. For example, something which went wrong in a previous project but hasn't been shared in a robust lessons learned and is now happening again. This is very frustrating and usually avoidable. Unknown unknowns are the true surprises, the things you never dreamt of happening. For example, the injection molding company you're using goes into liquidation and the liquidator seizes your tooling, which belongs to you. This has happened to me before about 15 years ago, and I nearly lost a thumb trying to recover some very heavy tooling from the liquidator. It was all legitimate though. Bear in mind that nobody knows everything, so having to support a network, having a support network of the right people is vital to success in a timely and cost-effective fashion. Now, it's impossible for anyone to know all regulations and standards. If you look at the IHS website, for example, where you can purchase standards, they have standards and specifications from over 460 different technical societies. So that's a huge number, and each one of those will have hundreds of specifications and standards of their own. Consequently, it's not practical to go into any real depth during a 10-minute presentation, so I hope to bring some awareness of the subject area and give you some food for thought. The graphic here outlines the order of precedence for requirements. So at the very top, we have mandatory laws and regulations, which of course are compulsory. They also vary by jurisdiction. During the requirement capture phase of the project, you consciously choose target markets, which will influence the laws and regulations which apply. Be aware that these will vary according to geography. Now, laws are set by national lawmakers with the purpose of promoting safety and environmental protection, and these are, of course, mandatory. Regulations generally override standards. Regulations are rules set by public or government bodies to influence market activity to maximise welfare. Directives are similar to regulations, but lay out goals rather than prescriptive rules. How you achieve the goals are up to you. Similarly to laws, regulations and directives vary according to jurisdiction. Examples of directives are the 21 European directives, EU directives, which trigger the need for CE marking. For example, the Pressure Equipment Directive or Low Voltage Directive, and many more. At this point, it's worth also remembering contract law. Now, whilst a standard or specification itself might not be mandatory, the contract you have with your client very possibly makes it a mandatory legal requirement, so be sure to triple check the references in your client's specification or order. A standard is any specification for physical characteristics, configuration, material, performance, etc., the application of which is recognised as necessary for the repeatability and interchangeability, for example, for common interfaces or fasteners, and the reference was given by Matt earlier about the International Space Station and SpaceX, which is a good example of that. Standards take a number of forms, including but not limited to industry, national and international standards. These can generally be viewed as best practice and are not generally compulsory. However, in some jurisdictions, national standards are mandatory, so bear that in mind. Depends on the regulation. A point worth noting as well is that it's often difficult to demonstrate due diligence has been followed in the event of an accident if a best practice as portrayed in a standard has knowingly been ignored. So keep that in mind. Specifications can be in the form of company specifications, for example, general requirements, or project specifications, which document specific requirements for the project. And there's another level not shown here, or it's just highlighted at the bottom, where in-house procedures exist at organisational levels. These exist to create robust, reliable and repeatable processes to enable organisations to follow best practices, complying with industry standards, complying with law and meeting requirements cost effectively, maintaining their margins. So to summarise some key takeaway points, nailing down the requirements as robustly as possible is essential. Everything hangs off this. You can change them, but any changes after the design freeze will likely lead to rework, which adds cost and delays to the plan. You need to be diligent. You don't know what you don't know, so make sure to be robust in your market research. Don't be afraid to ask questions. On that note, don't work in isolation. Through your research, it's likely that you will encounter experts and/or potential development or supply chain partners. Work with them. They want you to have a success too. You're a potential customer or supplier, so it's in their interest to make you succeed, to help you succeed. There are lots of tools that you can utilize in your product development journey. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Templates exist for FMEAs, FMICAs, product design specifications, etc. There's numerous technology qualification frameworks as well. The most commonly used is probably DNV's recommended practice. These outline structured approaches to help mature your technology up the TRL ladder, and they're worth looking at. So you need to identify and capture risks using risk registers or FMEAs, put mitigations in place by design where possible to eliminate or reduce these risks. You should always follow regulations and laws, including the contractual obligations, and you should follow standards where appropriate or contractually obliged to do so. But bear in mind, there's not a standard for everything, but as Stuart mentioned, there's probably a standard that will help you out along the way. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rory, and thanks to all three of our speakers today. We were aware when we took on this topic, I guess, as part of this series, that we were covering an extremely broad area, and indeed one that is pretty dense as well. So, despite the best efforts of the valiant efforts of our speakers, who've done a terrific job of trying to articulate the finer points in only a 10-minute slot, inevitably we are just scratching the surface. So I would encourage you at home to please do follow up with our panelists for more information. I'd also like to direct you towards the chat function as part of this meeting. There are lots of useful links and information pieces that have been shared throughout that I think would be of value. And of course, we can cover some of the questions just now as we branch into the Q&A. So thank you for bringing your questions forward as the session has gone on. there are a number here, and I'm going to go through as many as I can, and we'll kind of do it roughly on a kind of one panelist per question basis. Having said that, if there is one of the other panelists who would like to chip in on an answer, just raise your hand or wave at me or unmute yourself and jump in at any time, and we can do that. So Stuart, I'm going to start with yourself as the first speaker. And we had a question coming in, which I think is a very good one, and I've seen this happening firsthand. Too often, I guess, risk assessments, risk registers can be a little bit of a tick box. They're completed and then they're kind of filed away. How often do you recommend kind of revisiting and updating these?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that even if the risk register is only done once and then not looked at again, there will still have been value in doing that. But if you're not going back to it throughout the project, then I think you're really not making the most of the investment that you made in doing it in the first place. So it's definitely worthwhile in your project process having some kind of checkpoints where you go back, not least because it can be very positive in showing how many risks you've reduced and addressed in the work that you've done since you last looked at it. So I think if you're working in a kind of waterfall stage gate type process, then definitely making sure that the risk register has been updated, or the risk registers, because as I said, there may be a technical risk register and a project risk register and a finance risk register. It's definitely worth making sure that those have been updated at that stage. If you work in a more agile sprint-based way, then maybe you should define every few sprints that you have a task, or you have an epic within that, because risks occur regardless of what kind of project management methodology you're using. So either way, it's definitely worth having that as part of your project process.
And I guess as well, I've got you as a kind of follow up to that. I mean, in your experience, what sort of risks are, maybe this is maybe not the easiest one to answer, but what sort of risks are most commonly overlooked, even if it's kind of category of risk that's often overlooked, if not specific risk?
I think it's risks associated with regulations that you're not aware of, or risks associated with changing the market for your product at a later date. So if you suddenly decide that actually your main market is going to be the US rather than Europe, then you might have completely different requirements that are then very difficult to fit.
Okay, cool. No, that makes perfect sense. So, Alistair, if I could come to you next. So, obviously, you're talking about a culture of change, and with the responsibility of that exists at the top, and has to I guess infiltrate all the way through the organisation, so to speak. I guess easier said than done, right? So, I mean, is there any kind of tips or things that you've seen in your experience that can help to accelerate that process, or do you believe that ultimately regulation is kind of the key to that in terms of it being an obligation and almost enforced?
I think the point there is it's very much about the culture in an organisation. And as we were talking about, if things are intuitive or second nature, people will buy into it. If you're making it an onerous activity that you've got to sign 50 documents to get one particular part released or whatever, people are not going to buy into it. So it's about having as simple as possible process in place that will cover what you're trying to achieve. And that's the way you get buy-in, and that's the way that you will actually get people to support it. But it has to come, as we talked about, from top management initially. It has to be through the whole organisation without shadow of doubt. And can I interject as well, just one point regarding the kind of risk register update? It also very much depends on the area you're working in. And we talked a little bit there about post-market surveillance and cybersecurity. If you're talking about cybersecurity, you need somebody who's monitoring the market on a daily basis. So assessing the threats that come from cybersecurity attacks is something that just never stops throughout the life of a product. So very much depends what area you're actually working in.
Yeah, I just to kind of expand a little bit on that culture thing, and I guess winning the hearts and minds battle, which I know is often difficult, I guess, from a regulatory point, and I think unfairly often that regulations and standards are accused almost of stifling innovation. I mean, is it? How would you, I guess, defend regulation and standards in that sense as being far from stifling innovation, but actually being an opportunity, perhaps even to inspire innovation? Is that how you would see it?
Yeah, I mean, there are standards. I mean, we do, as mentioned, a lot of work in the automotive sector. And there's one, it's not a standard yet, it's still a publicly available specification, but it's very much about safety of the intended functionality. It's aimed at the sector of autonomous driving. And that kind of document is helping people, it's accompanying people through the journey of what is a very challenging area. So they're not just tick box activities at the end, they are things that can help and guide and steer your development activities. So it very much depends which area you're focusing on, but some standards are far more on the innovative edge of things rather than just being the tick box, have we done it properly after the event type of documents.
Sure. Yeah, no, I understand. And Rory, if I can come to you next, the questions to you, these people seem to be keen to tap into your knowledge of the reference background by the looks of it. So there's two kind of slightly more specific questions here. But so we have a question, what are some good resources which can help understand the regulations and standards which apply to a consumer product? Are you able to direct anybody?
Yeah, well, there's no magic answer to that, really. I mean, there needs to be a bit of awareness about the application, the sector. Consumer products could take any number of forms. I think I had a reference to a mountain biking standard earlier, so anyone can go out and buy a mountain bike, but it has to comply with a standard. But to be aware of that standard's existence, you need to know to look for it to some extent. I mean, it's a bit of a cop out, the answer, to be honest, because there's no magic solution. But I mean, for consumer products, there's a lot of sort of basic product safety stuff that you need to comply with. So it depends on the jurisdiction and it depends on the sector. So if you're selling something in Europe, CE marking comes into it, obviously. So there's 21 CE directives, that might be a good place to start, I would say. So there could be things like general product safety in there. There could be things around low voltage or pressure containment, all these sort of things, so things that you can buy on the market as a consumer have to comply with that, and you see CE marks on most things you purchase, although it can be mistaken for a Chinese export mark, which looks very similar.
That's a good tip. And I guess on the kind of reference theme, in your experience, is there a simple and preferred FMEA guide you could direct people to?
Not really. So we've gone through the process of creating our own as part of our process. So we've created FMEA and FMICA. So FMICA is used in more high integrity sectors like oil and gas. So FMICA is basically failure modes and effects and criticality analysis. So you also add in a criticality analysis. So we've created our own templates for both. I'd like to be able to share them. I'm not sure that they're in a condition to share at the moment, but I can double check with my team and see if we'd be able to share that with people. We would like ultimately to be able to host these things on a platform on the internet for all to be able to access. But you can play tunes with them. They're all much of a muchness, I would say, and they're trying to achieve the same thing. Maybe the other guys have got some good examples, but they're all doing the same thing. It's just a different way of presenting it. Quite often it'll be an Excel tool.
Yeah. Just to chip in there is a IEC 6825, which is an FMEA standard, but the automotive industry tends to be far better than some other industries in this. And if you look at the likes of the VDA or the AIAG, they've got very good guidelines on producing FMEAs, including the scoring systems.
Yeah, and on that subject, there's also a British standard for design reviews as well. So it's not a question that's been asked, but it's something we talked about. I think it's like BS 6000 something. So there is a lot of precedent, a lot of material out there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you guys, and I appreciate for those at home that may be less familiar with this area that that's a lot of acronyms and a lot of numbers to try and get your head around. So again, I would encourage you to follow up with our panelists who will be able to expand on that slightly. It can be quite a daunting area to find yourself in without that level of experience. So please do reach out to them directly, or you can do it through the KTN or Product Design Scotland as well. I've actually just noticed the time, so we're actually just about out of time for the Q&A. So many thanks for those who submitted questions. And many thanks once again to our panelists for their presentations and their engagement within the Q&A. That's it for this part of the meeting. So it just leaves me to hand over now to Matt, who is just going to do a quick summary and wrap up. So Matt, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ahmed. Well, I mean, I know I found it really interesting, so I hopefully you all did, and you'll get the link to the video later on, so you can revisit it and see what you missed. Please do use the Mojo networking. The link's still on the chat, so really would encourage you to do that, to meet people. If you need to be, or if you'd like to be introduced to the panelists or people that were on this call, just get in touch with us at KTN or Ali and the team at Product Design Scotland, and we can make those introductions for you, no problem. So the next event in this series is in next week, same time next week, basically. That's on building supply chains, and I think that's particularly relevant these days in these COVID times, is actually understanding where the supply is coming from and in the supply chains. And then following that, next week on from that, with networking in collaboration. And I think Rory sort of mentioned, you can't do this in isolation. It's more than ever. I think we need these need these kind of opportunities for networking and collaboration. And actually, and then after that is design thinking and system principles, and really sort of embedding the good ways of working in from the start, and not leaving it till later. So I don't think I had anything else to say. So I think we'll end it here. And it's great to see everybody, and stay safe, and see you at the next one.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.